I was very, very comfortable asking people for help. I think that's one of the bottom lines that entrepreneurs suffer is they believe that asking for help is a sign of weakness or failure. Absolutely not. Being an entrepreneur isn't about, trying to figure out how to do something that's been done by millions of others. It's how you can figure out how you fit into the scenario. And there's so much knowledge out there, so many ideas out there, podcasts like yours. To be quite frank, there's so much information. Why not just humble yourself and ask the question, how do I do this?
Hey there, friends. Welcome back to the Millennial Mastermind Podcast, the show for entrepreneurial millennials looking for the tools, tactics, and inspiration to take your business and your life to the next level. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Alvin Law to the Mastermind. I first heard Alvin's story through a motivational video that I came across on Facebook and was totally blown away by his story and his message and just knew I had to invite him to be a guest on the show. Alvin is a former radio broadcaster turned motivational speaker and an absolute rock star. We're definitely lucky to have him here with us today. So Alvin, welcome to the show, my friend.
Such a pleasure to be here. I mean it, Brad. Anybody that puts on a show that tries to help people get better at what they're scared of I'm in, man. It's going to be a great interview.
Beautiful. Yes, it is. It is. So I would love, I didn't want to go too deep into your bio when I did the reading because I think you're going to be the best person to talk through your journey, some of the challenges that you've overcome and the success that you've had. And I would love if you just share some of that story with the audience, and then we can dive into pieces of it. But if you wouldn't mind just giving a high level kind of overview and your journey to where you are today.
It's funny, Brad, because I am almost the most predictable guest you'll ever have in that I just stick out. I happen to have no arms. I was born this way. I was actually one of Canada's, I'm calling from Canada, one of Canada's first what's called thalidomide babies. That was a morning sickness medication that was given to pregnant women in the early 60s to combat nausea. It was since figured out that it was causing deformities, mostly to the limbs. So it varied in every case, over 20,000 babies around the world. Why that's an important beginning to this story, however, is you can imagine that might have suggested my future was set. I was going to have no arms. I was going to be handicapped. I was never going to be able to be independent. And on top of that, my birth family saw absolutely no hope for any future for me. This was, remember, 1960, so I'm not a young guy. They gave me up when I was 5 days old. So literally by the 5 days of age range, I was actually homeless. So can you imagine that start? That's what I mean. It's so predictable. So people that are right now going, oh, another one of these, I mean that with great respect. I am one of these. I'm one of these human stories that overcame what society described as immense obstacles to become a very successful professional speaker. I'm a world-class musician. I have had so much good fortune in my life. And to be quite frank, I think I was destined to be here on your show today because I was destined to have this life.
Yeah, I mean, it truly is, like you said, perceived obstacles and things that just from the get-go, society would maybe classify as you having a rough go at it. But yeah. I imagine a huge piece of your success story has to do with your attitude and being able to do things in a non-traditional way and think of things in a non-traditional way. So would you mind touching on that a little bit, how your attitude
Absolutely.
And perceptions has contributed to your ability to become a world-class speaker, and maybe talk a little bit about the musician side of things, because I think people are probably thinking, a guy with no arms, how has he become a musician? So I would love to hear about that.
Well, Brad, I'm surprised that I haven't had a made-for-TV movie, and I mean that with great humility. My story sounds too good to be true, yet it's so real. The answer to your question, to hit it dead on the spot, the beginning of my life being given up for adoption was the best thing that could have ever possibly happened to me. My birth family were not in a position to raise me. They were very poor. They were very young. They had a very very poor farm, no power, no running water in rural Canada. So when they gave me up, I ended up in the foster care system. And Brad, we've all heard stories, almost nightmarish stories of terrible foster homes. And to be quite frank, and I don't want to be too mean about this, but the media loves to pick up on sad stories that make us cry. And I understand that, but I don't really think that's good for us. I think whenever we're faced with a situation that makes us feel guilty, that's the wrong kind of motivation. Yet that was the sort of the perceived idea of what all of us, we called ourselves thalidomide babies, were going to be. Just like the foster homes, there's bad ones out there. But the reality is I landed in nirvana, to use a word. I really did. I landed in a place that wasn't, however, like paradise, in that everything was done for me. Here's the key to everything in our messaging today, Brad. I could paint all kinds of wonderful pictures and spray nice scents into the air about how beautiful life is. But life can really be crappy. And life can really be a challenge. And the ironic part is when you learn that that's the bottom line, then you start to accept the fact that you can take nothing and turn it into something, because you're not the first person to ever do this. My mom was a foster mom. She was used to looking after troubled children. She was ironically in her 50s, which means that, and I say ironically because you think she would have needed a youthful energy to raise me, but in fact had an older person's point of view to give me not only the idea that I could be whole and I could be complete, but I needed to struggle through to get to where I understood that's part of the natural process of life. And by growing up in small town Saskatchewan, I had access to things that you might not necessarily have access to if you lived in a bigger metropolitan area. So when I got into school, I got to go to public school. In those days, it was typical for handicapped children to go to special needs schools that were segregated. I know that's hard to believe, isn't it, that we still have that in our generation, but it's true. So mom and dad were very practical. Go to regular school. Because I went to regular school, I got to join the band. And because I got to join the band, I got to play trombone with my right foot, pulling and pushing on the slide of the trombone that was mounted to the side of a chair, because a band director in my little town of Yorkton, Saskatchewan, was one of those visionaries that I'm sure you've talked to lots on this show. He just saw something different in me than everybody else saw. So in other words, instead of seeing the obstacles that he would view looking at a little boy without arms, he saw the possibilities. And here's the key to this linkage. Because I got 96% on a music aptitude test in 5th grade at school. So he knew that I had an ability for music. His job was to figure out a way to get me playing in the band, which is exactly what he did. So you can see how this works. It's a wonderful example. But, at the end, Brad, if I can say one more quick thing, this is less my story and more the story of people that came into my life that helped me see what I could be. And to me, that is the spirit of entrepreneurialism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would love to go a little deeper into your perceptions on how you shared exactly what it is. Life is hard. Life can be challenging. And once you come to terms with that, that's when you can start making magic, because that's when you can start building something out of nothing, as many people have done before. So was music your kicking off or your launch pad into that perspective, where you could finally see something that you were able to really start from nothing and start to build a skill set and an ability that wasn't there before? Or were there other kind of key turning points for you that helped you to build that perspective and that attitude?
Well, first of all, that's a great question. And obviously all of these answers I'm trying to edit myself because this is a very complicated and deep story. I think what it boils down to, first of all, the first answer to your question is it was the culture that was created in our home. There was sympathy, but that's really the wrong word to use. I would stretch and use the word empathy. So my foster parents, although I didn't grow up with other foster siblings, they were decided to, mom and dad decided to not keep them. And they were usually teenagers. They were usually teenagers with addiction problems that had been removed from their homes or ran away or whatever. You can imagine the scenarios that are out there. So when I needed to be taken care of full time, my mom and dad decided they were going to take me. They obviously, I shouldn't say that, you don't know this, but in their mind, they obviously had no plans of starting another family in their mid-50s, and especially a newborn without arms. So I want you to picture in your minds, anyone who's listening to this, how you would see somebody like me. And then turn the mirror around and put it in front of yourself and ask yourself, would I be able to do this without arms? Now, your answer is probably no, because I'm asking a silly question. My answer is I had no choice. My arms were gone. There was no other alternative. People could say, well, there's artificial limbs. This was 1960. We didn't have robotics, even though today those would not even help me because I'm so natural with my feet. But here was the key. When I started using my toes, nothing in the world was designed for feet. So my mom had to devise schemes. So, for example, if your audience wants to imagine this, one of the first things I learned to do with my toes was to sew with a needle and thread, sewing buttons on rags over and over for hours at a time, because mom knew that I needed to develop my feet into a skill set. Then, dad was a mechanic. He'd bring home nuts and bolts from work, and I would screw them on and off and on and off for again, hours at a time. I never thought of it as a mundane task. I thought of it as the foundation to be able to get better at what I was doing with my feet. But here's the other key. I was little. I didn't know any better. I assumed everybody had tough lives. I assumed everybody had obstacles to overcome. It wasn't until I got to go to school that I realized my mindset was already ahead of the curve, because I had, first of all, accepted that I had to fail to succeed. But here was the key. School or education for me, because of the alternative of going to the special school, was a privilege. I believe too many people believe they have a right to success and don't understand the element of what earning it is actually the most important thing.
Yeah, and I think one thing you said there, that you were little and you were young and you thought that everybody just had these challenges to overcome and had a hard go at it, is a pretty interesting perspective, because it sheds light on where we really get ourselves into trouble. And this is speaking from personal experiences, when we start comparing ourselves to others. And
Yes.
A lot of times, in your case, it's a pretty obvious comparison of, oh, I don't have arms, but everybody else does. I have to learn how to do things with my feet that nobody else has to learn. But we all do this on so many different levels. Social media is obviously talked about as one of the main culprits of this, of seeing a filtered perspective into somebody else's life, that you're really just seeing the highlight reel. But it happens on so many different levels. And so I think that's just an interesting observation that you recognize that at an early point in your life.
Well, the other thing too, Brad, to add one more idea behind this thing, is that I was the only person, not only in our community, that happened to have no arms. I never met anybody like me ever. I actually didn't meet anybody like me face to face until I was in my late 20s. Not that they aren't out there. Now, social media, you bet. Internet has shown us all kinds of images. In fact, to be quite blunt, I find it fascinating how much is out there online that we can find of people using their feet, that in my day growing up, there was none of that. So even more importantly, this is kind of maybe a turn on what people thought I was going to say with this. When I had no example to set for me, I had no example to tell me I couldn't do it. There was no mindset that said you can't do this, because, okay, I'm gonna be really, really frank now, and I hope this doesn't cause too much of the uncomfortable feeling in your audience. It would be awesome if people could actually see me, to look at me, and of course they can go to my website to check that out. But one of my favorite things to pose to an audience is questions. I get questions all the time. And the first question I ever got in front of a youth audience way back in 1981, when I did my first ever public speech, was, are you ready, Rick? How do you go to the bathroom? So imagine that question and ask it to yourself right now, the people that are listening to this. That's a really important question to ask, because how was I going to go to the bathroom? Well, that was one of those things that made me uncomfortable. Of course, I wasn't going to tell people this when I was young growing up, but it occurred to me that, try to figure out how you'd work your way around that. But if you couldn't work your way around it, let's just imagine that. I was very, very comfortable asking people for help. I think that's one of the bottom lines that entrepreneurs suffer, is they believe that asking for help is a sign of weakness or failure. Absolutely not. Being an entrepreneur isn't about, trying to figure out how to do something that's been done by millions of others. It's how you can figure out how you fit into the scenario. And there's so much knowledge out there, so many ideas out there, podcasts like yours. To be quite frank, there's so much information. Why not just humble yourself and ask the question, how do I do this? Mm-hmm. And I think that was one of the most important things, is it wasn't comfortable for me to face the fact I couldn't do things. And by the way, I did learn to go to the bathroom by myself. But it was tough. Some of the toughest obstacles, once we get over them, we realize, oh my God, am I ever glad I didn't quit just because, we've heard this before, haven't we? So many people quit just before they've managed to come over the top of the hump because it's so hard to get to the top. But once you're at the top, then the rest is simply a downhill slide.
Yeah, absolutely. 3 feet from gold. How many people have quit when they were right at that precipice of what could have been a major achievement?
Yeah.
I would also love to go a little further into your story. So you discover music in school. That plays a huge role into your life. What comes next for you after school when you're starting to think about a career and starting to think about what you're going to do with your life? And when does motivational speaking come into the picture?
So, well, let me do the end of the answer first. In our house, and you have to live in our house to truly understand how bizarre our house is, and I mean that in a very, very positive way. I'll talk about my wife a little bit more in a bit, but my wife and I worked together in the speaking industry because she saw the fact that I could have had any job in the world. I could have done any job reasonably. I mean, I wasn't going to be a dentist. Can you imagine that one? But but because of my successful mindset, I could just about do anything. But where the end of the story links back to the very, very middle. And I by the way, I probably should mention one more thing about music. Music not only was a solo pursuit. In other words, you practice on your own. You try to get better on your own. But here's the thing. I talked about the trombone. What I left out was two other very important instruments in the story. The first instrument is the piano. I wanted to play the piano because everyone around me at 9 years old were getting piano lessons, right? That's what 9-year-olds do. At least they did when I was a kid. So when I tried to play piano, the piano teacher in town, who was very, very old and very, very cynical, although she was a great teacher, we know people like that, decided that it would be pointless trying to even teach me one lesson because my toes would simply never function on a keyboard. Now, we believed her. That's the point. We believed her. She was an expert. But the ironic part is that's when I got into trombone. It was about a year later I joined the band. But in joining the band, I established my first set of friends. I had other friends in school, but those started to fall by the wayside, as kids will do when they get to be 9 or 10 or 11 years old and they don't want to hang out with the kid who doesn't quite fit. We've all been there, right, in terms of either being one or seeing one. So to be quite frank again, it was that ironic oddity that I had of my body shape that made people want to know more about the person inside. I couldn't impress them with my physical perfection, but I had a very active mind and it turns out a pretty darn good sense of humor. So people actually started to want to hang out with me because I was odd, not because I was like everybody else. That's how I started playing the drums because I thought, oh, I could play anything. I just wanted to play the drums. So I was playing drums. I was thinking to myself, maybe I should go back and pick up the piano, but I was too busy with all the things I was doing. And here's the point of that long answer. I was convinced I was going to be a professional musician. That was my plan. I was so good at it, and I really was good at it, that I wanted to go out there and do that. But my guidance counselor in high school, we've all had those guidance counselors, suggested that I needed to find something more practical and less dream-like. Here's the problem with being a dreamer. Sometimes it's not practical to make a living at it, right? Let's be blunt about that. But here was what I learned. I could find something else to do that if I listened to the noise coming from the other side of the equation, which was in this case, Mr. Sherwin, my counselor, he suggested a career in broadcasting. So I went off to broadcasting school here in Calgary, where I live now. I graduated after 2 years. You get a diploma. I got a job in radio. I was an FM disc jockey on old school vinyl FM classic rock. And I loved that job, but I knew that there was one thing I was doing. I was hiding. I didn't recognize it at the time. In retrospect, I figured this out. But I was sitting in a booth because I really didn't want everything about Alvin Law to be about having no arms. That makes sense? I wanted to be normal, but I was also 20. So I was to be respectful to everybody who's 20. I was immature. I was naive. I hadn't been around long enough yet to really formally understand what having no arms actually meant to me. So when I figured that out, that was when I started going out and doing things as a broadcaster, emceeing, master ceremonies, different events. And people would want to know about my life, not broadcasting. And it occurred to me, I could actually make a living doing this. So I actually did it in 1981. I quit my radio job and I started going out. Then I was working for an agency here that's a nonprofit called Easter Seals. In the States, I believe it's called March of Dimes. I was out doing school talks. I was talking to youth. But more than anything, I realized my story was compelling, but my ability to tell it was everything.
And so from there, you've been doing this since 81 for over 30 years then.
Yeah, it's coming up. Actually, the decision I made would have happened in February of 1981, which is coming up on what that would be 38 years. Oh my God, has it been 38 years? But here's the most important thing, and I think all of the audience really needs to hear this. I didn't do it since then wall to wall. I did it for 4 years. I was young. I then got into a relationship, and I will tell you that it wasn't romantic, that produced a child. That changed my focus from being a speaker to getting what we joke about in our house here, a real job. So actually, because of my contacts in nonprofit, I managed to score myself a job at an advertising agency being an account executive, because I was really good at writing, really good at producing videos and commercials. I did that for 3 years. I took a stab at running for provincial government office. So in Canada, it would be a member of the legislature, not unlike a member of your state legislature. I tried that. I lost by less than 500 votes, but I learned that politics was not my game. And I'll tell you why. I was too nice and I was too principled. And I'm not suggesting that politicians are none of those things, but in my gut, I said, I can't play that evil game. But what I can do is work in an agency job with the government promoting disability awareness. So I actually opened up the first disability directorate for the province of Saskatchewan, working for the government. But I hated it. I hated having a 9 to 5. I hated working in the bureaucracy where it seems like their model is, let's think of all the ways you can fail. Because government is just this behemoth, isn't it? This huge, immovable monster sometimes. And I just wasn't built that way. But I think this is the key, man. I was unhappy in my life. I was in a terrible relationship. I was in an abusive relationship, speaking of the Me Too movement, and I had a little boy. So, at that point in 1988, I left everything. I left my job. I left my marriage. I moved out on my own, and I decided I'm going to try this one more time to become a professional speaker. And that is when it all started. And yes, I have been doing it full time ever since. And other than a couple of lean years, it has mostly been successful ever since. And I just think it's because this is what I was meant to do.
Well, I'm glad you actually shared that additional detail there, that you started it, had to come back to it, left it for a little while, because more and more as I get into these conversations and having the opportunity to speak with amazing guests like yourself has helped me to realize this, is that success usually isn't just a very straight line shot, from point A to point B. Usually there's a lot of zigzags. Sometimes you go back to point, negative C and then come back up to point A and start over. But I think it's important to note that, because especially when early on in the journey, sometimes that's hard to remember and that's hard to have that perspective. And when some of those speed bumps come along, the idea of giving up is pretty easy, but the idea that we can even come back to something sometimes gets lost. So I appreciate you sharing the full journey, Alvin.
Absolutely.
So over your years of between music, your different careers, and then ultimately coming into this career as motivational speaker, are there any lessons that you've learned along the way that if you could go back in time to, let's call it 1981, when you were first starting that journey, that you would give to yourself at that point in time?
God, that you got about 3 hours.
Yeah, as long as it takes, man.
Here's my favorite. Here's my favorite one. Actually, I was thinking of it as soon as you asked it. I always like to go for the gut reaction. So when I realized I wanted to be a speaker, it was recommended to me that I attend a speakers convention. I didn't even know that kind of thing existed. And in fact, then I found out we didn't have it in Canada then when I realized this, but there was an association in the United States, which was the first one, called the National Speakers Association. So I thought, I should maybe check them out. And then it turned out that Canada did have one. So it wasn't in my town, but I was able to join when I moved to Calgary. So I went to my first couple of conventions. Now, can you imagine going to a convention, for example, in the United States? This was in Orlando. It was, one of the big hotels. There was like almost 2,000 speakers there. It was so overwhelming that I almost just went home. I was so intimidated, not by the fact that I didn't think I could do this, but I wondered if I had made the wrong decision, because there was 2,000 people in that room, not even the ones that aren't members of the association or at the convention, that I'm going to be up against with the competition. And I just felt overwhelmed. But then I realized, because one of the great founders of National Speakers Association, a guy named Cavett Robert, had this wonderful line. And he said that the pie is big enough for everybody, that everybody gets a slice. And the most important thing is not to see other speakers as your competitors, but as your peers. And when I started thinking about that, I realized that's true. You'll every now and then meet somebody when you're competing in any kind of trade that you see as the bad guy. But when we start thinking negatively about things, and this is where it gets a little woo-woo, we start to introduce so much negative energy into our bodies. What I realized I needed to do was soak up the positive energy of being around all these wonderful speakers, get to know them, ask them questions, get advice, and learn about what they did, so I didn't have to make the same mistakes twice. Now, I realize that sounds so cliche. Well, because it is. So many things in life are exactly that. They're simple. We overcomplicate things, but here's the bottom line, my friend. We need to get over our insecurity. I think most people have a very, very hidden sense of insecurity. And that insecurity gives us doubt, and that doubt stops us from trying things we believe we could do. But that doubt and insecurity is what stops us the first time we fail. And again, when it becomes part of your culture of having no arms, failure is simply just another step in the process.
Yeah, and I think it all stems from fear of failure,
Sure.
fear of what if I do this and I can't be successful, or I never reach the level of these 2,000 people in this room.
Yeah.
And it strikes such a chord with me when you think about the podcasting space. There's so many people out there doing it really well, and it could be overwhelming. So that's really cool. So what would be then the tangible piece of advice that you would give to yourself in 1981 based on that experience?
Trust your gut.
Mm-hmm.
I've always been ahead of the curve, it turns out. I've always seen things differently. I was the first one that in my circle as a speaker was starting to promote the idea that having a disability isn't a bad thing. I started focusing on the stories of successful people. And, one shameful plug here, and I know you're probably going to do this anyway, but if people want to see the perfect example of what I'm talking about, I know you mentioned the Change the Label video on Goldcast, but if you go to alvinlaw.com or you go to my YouTube channel, which is just Alvin Toes Law, there's a great video of me with a band. In 2016, I played the drums in a band in London, England. We were filming a promotional video for the 2016 Paralympics in Rio. We actually filmed in a sound studio. The video came out in the fall of 2016. It had 105 million hits on the website for the channel before they had to take it down. And we actually recorded the soundtrack. Some of your younger listeners might not be familiar with this place, called Abbey Road Studios, which is where the Beatles recorded. My point is that video is profound. It is amazing. It's a little weird when you go to my website because it's hard to see. But it's the picture of a little woman wearing a swimsuit. You push play on that, and this amazing video comes up. But here's the point. When people see that product, they see what people with disabilities are truly capable of. And I know they're each individual. This isn't the status quo. Not everybody's like that. I get that. But if you don't set your sights on making things better by your belief system, you'll just do the same thing over and over and over again. You'll be like a hamster running around on a wheel. We're putting in lots of effort, but we're not getting anywhere because we're not opening our mind to new ideas, to new concepts, but more than anything, being the one that introduces that very thing. Can you imagine when you find something that you think you've been thinking about, nobody's ever done it, and you just keep putting it off and putting it off and putting it off? That is the one big problem, and that's where insecurity is the enemy. If you got a gut idea, something you want to do, give it a shot. You never know what you can create.
Well, Alvin, yeah, that's awesome. We'll make sure to have all of those links included here in the show notes, alvinlaw.com, your YouTube page, the Goalcast video, as well as that video that you just mentioned. So I just want to go ahead and thank you so much for taking the time to share all of these insightful nuggets of wisdom and your journey. It's truly inspiring what you've accomplished. And I appreciate you for spending over 30 years just providing motivation to people and being willing to share your journey so that other people can benefit from the things that you've learned along the way. So thank you very much.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Brad. And you know what? Thank you for doing this too. And I meant what I said. My son, that one that I had way back in the 80s, is now 33. And he listens to all kinds of podcasts because he understands that there's knowledge out there. He wants to be better like us all. And I think that's the bottom line. I'm not in this for my ego. I'm in this to do exactly what my mom who adopted me did for me. And that's try to put me into a place where she could sit back, and she passed away in 96, but she could at least sit back and go, there, I knew I was right. And I know that sounds really smug, but that's the bottom line of being an entrepreneur is, you know, wishing and hoping and knowing that you can get to a place in your life at some point where you can look back and go, ha, I knew I was right.
Yes, I love it. And she was right, and you're right with everything that you've said today. And I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing with us.
Thanks, Brad. And wishing everybody a very abundant and very meaningful 2019. And remember, all the negativity out there is only one side of the story. Thinking positive can change your life, period.